For us at the Human Rights Foundation and the conference that we produce called the Oslo Freedom Forum, we're delighted to be here and collaborate with Blockchangers to discuss an important idea, and that is in terms of governance. So in governance, in the real world or in the political world, humans have over thousands of years figured out how to govern each other without a single point of control, right? So we had, after the agricultural revolution, hierarchical power systems for thousands of years where there'd be one king or one lord or one tyrant in control. Now, the seeds of something different were laid thousands of years ago by the Greeks, and now today we have half the world living under a decentralized governance system where power is not held by one person or one institution, but it is checked across several institutions: the executive, the military, the press, the courts, the legislature. This is a pretty radical, remarkable thing that humans have figured out how to do, how to govern themselves in a decentralized way. And this is something that may be possible also with money and other kinds of networking. In 2009, the idea of Bitcoin was born, and the idea of maybe we could have decentralized money in addition to decentralized governance. The idea that we could have a money network that not one person controlled, that not one government can control, that really was, for all intents and purposes, pretty much censorship resistant, was born. And this is a very radical idea. I would say equally as radical as the idea of decentralized governance. So when we're looking at this from our perspective at the Human Rights Foundation and the Oslo Freedom Forum, we are looking at this from the perspective of people who live under highly, highly repressive authoritarian governments. So just like the idea of encryption or like secret messaging is probably not that appealing for you in Norway because you really don't have anything to hide, right? But it's very, very appealing for someone who lives in Saudi Arabia or China or Iran or Venezuela. In the same way, something like Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency that would be independent of the state is not that appealing here because you guys have a banking system that works, you have a financial system that works, you have depositor insurance, but billions of people live in countries where they definitely don't have depositor insurance. In fact, the state will just come and take your stuff. That is like normal for most human beings. So again, I think we need to kind of globalize our perspective a little bit. And I think from what we've seen at the Human Rights Foundation, working with people across like 90 countries around the world where they don't have the luxuries we have in Norway or in Tokyo or in Costa Rica or in the United States, in countries that are more free and open, that have more decentralized governance. When you're looking at countries that are actually authoritarian, you're seeing like people starting to use encryption and Bitcoin and censorship-resistant storage and all kinds of sort of like anti-authoritarian technology because they have to use it, right? Not just because it's a cool idea or an experiment, but because it's like the way that they need to live their life. So we want to explore this today, this intersection of cryptocurrency and blockchain projects with the economic and the political. So delighted to welcome up Maria and Eric. We talked about this a few months ago, putting this together. I had noticed that Eric just had this incredibly incisive commentary about this industry, and I wanted him to share this message with you all tonight. So I'm delighted to have you.
Hello. Wow, there's so many people. I think there are more people here. That's Oslo Innovation Week. Yes, we win.
Hello. Hi.
Yes, welcome, Eric. I am very excited that you're joining us today. I'll just say very shortly how we all ended up here. Oslo Freedom Forum organized a really interesting blockchain event together with Catapult, and inspired by that, we started talking with Alex. What if we could do something else? And I thought, oh, Blockchangers is an interesting company. I'll talk to them. And I was not working in Blockchangers at the time. And I was just going to have a coffee with Jon, one of the founders at Blockchangers, and just like discuss, maybe we should, like, Oslo Freedom is cool, you're cool, maybe we could do something, and I'm just in the middle. And that turned out to be a job interview, because Jon was like, maybe you should just start working with us. And I'm like, no, I don't have a time. And now I'm here, working 50%. I'm very happy about it. So a short story about that. Enough about me. Let's talk about what is your background, Eric, and how did you end up being interested in the topic of cryptocurrency and many other?
Okay, so first of all, I just want to say I'm very happy to be invited here. It's an honor. I came into Oslo today, and I've already had. I used to live in Norway previously in in Tromsø many years ago, and the only thing that I remember is that everything was so expensive. And one of the first things that happened to me when I came to my hotel was that the water in my tap was brown. So I called the reception and asked if they had some bottled water that I could drink, and they came with a bottle of water to my room, and the price was 193 Norwegian kroner. So I'm like, what is going on? Yeah, so to answer your question, so I'm from the cryptocurrency community, and I don't know how much you talk about individual freedom and how that relates to monetary policy and monetary infrastructure, but for us who come from the cryptocurrency industry, that's literally what the entire movement is about. Well, to be fair, it's also about other things like gambling and speculation and drugs and sex and rock and roll and all that stuff also. But then I suppose, I mean, that's also expressions of freedom, so I suppose that fits into the same umbrella. But anyway, yeah, so that's why I think we could potentially find some common ground here and find something interesting to discuss, given how the synergies between cryptocurrency and personal freedom.
And today you're working as a system analyst, right?
I work as a cryptocurrency system analyst as a side thing. That's what I do. That's what my hobby is. My current employment is at a technology firm. We build exchange and clearing technology for global marketplaces, so like the London Metal Exchange and the Australian Securities Exchange. And in that company, I work with the blockchain strategy, and I work as a technical expert. So I advise the company on what we should do, how should we interact with the blockchain technology, and how do we develop our business in that space.
And then you're also active on Twitter. If you haven't been following Eric on Twitter, I suggest you do that. You have a lot of interesting tweets out there on this topic.
Thank you.
So, yeah, let's get to it. You mentioned that the cryptocurrency movement is a lot about personal freedom. When we were discussing this earlier, could you, why?
Yeah, so I think there's two things to that. It's both the monetary policy and the monetary infrastructure, and when I say that, it's important to understand the context that we're talking about. So I'm not particularly talking about Sweden or Norway. I'm more talking about countries like Venezuela and Argentina and Turkey, and the difference between these countries is that in Sweden and Norway, there's a clear distinction between the state and the central bank. You have an economist here in Norway. His name is Finn Skydland, I think, and he's a Nobel Prize winner in economics. And he's a very big proponent of this idea that there must be a separation between the central banks and the government, because the issue that you have there is that the government can use the monetary policy of a country to reach short-term economic and political goals. So they can tamper with the money supply. Let's say they want to fund some war, or they want to reach various political goals. They can basically print money, and when they do that, they move wealth from the savers in the country to the government. So the central banks have become a tool, and it wasn't always like that. I mean, it's a relatively new phenomenon that money is something that the governments can arbitrarily print. It wasn't always like that. If we go back 100 years, when the whole world was on the gold standard, that wasn't the case. But it's sort of a new phenomenon. So I think that's sort of the heart of the issue, whether or not the central banks should have anything to do with the money supply at all.
And someone, for me, coming to Norway as a refugee from a very kind of unstable country, it's always very fascinating to see how much trust, for example, Norwegians have in the state, in the systems that work. and how little I sometimes have it, and like it's been a practice to actually believe in that. Why, like you mentioned, the countries like Venezuela, Argentina. What is? Could you tell us a little bit what is happening there and why the cryptocurrency can matter?
Yeah. Okay. So if we take Venezuela, for example, that's a country that their budget for the government depended heavily on oil, and when the oil prices went down, what the government did was basically they printed money to pay the government salaries in order to maintain the control of the population. And what that has led to is that the people in Venezuela has basically seen their wealth deteriorate. So if you'd worked your entire life in Venezuela to save up your money, then just because of the economic policy and the government in Venezuela, those people are now seeing their life fortunes disappear overnight. I got interested in this a couple of years ago, and I was looking at the Bolivar exchange rate to the dollar. And when I looked at it the first time, it was something like 80 bolivars for $1. And it was just fascinating to me. I kept refreshing this site, and at one point it was 300 bolivar. And I don't know what happened. It was just insane to see, but it got up to like 1,000 bolivar and then a 50,000. And I think that today it's more than 1 million bolivar to $1. So those people who stored their wealth in their nation's currency, they can't do anything now. They can't move abroad. Their lives have been ruined. So I think it's very important that those people have an alternative system so that they can participate in an economy without being exposed to these risks.
But who will be making these alternative systems? Will it be the private sector?
Well, hopefully that's something that we can what I'm excited about now is seeing how technologists can actually contribute to that change. So previously, in order to change the economic policy, it's been up to the government to mandate that, but we've seen now that with technology we can actually create monetary systems, decentralized monetary systems, and that's I think there's a great opportunity here to actually bring some real change to the world. That's exciting.
Would you say something else on monetary infrastructure versus policy? Or
yeah, sure. So
touched upon a bit.
Yeah, so on monetary policy and monetary infrastructure, perhaps that's not very clear, but if we start with monetary infrastructure and we think about a country like Turkey, the problem is when you have digital money in these digital monetary systems that are controlled by banks, and if you're a political activist or if you say something that goes against the regime, what can happen is that the government can decide that you're an enemy of the state, and they can freeze your bank accounts and basically remove your ability to fight the charges that has been put against you. And we see that also similar things happening in the U.S. with the Trump administration is embracing these civil asset forfeiture laws, where even before you've been convicted of the crime, the government can take the assets from you, and that is something that challenges your ability to fight the charges themselves. And I guess the most obvious example of how monetary infrastructure can harm, for example, political companies like WikiLeaks, for instance. That it was, I suppose people have heard about that in 2010 when MasterCard and Visa, on the authority of the U.S., restricted access to donations. So just on the authority of the U.S., the money inflows were prevented for these companies, and WikiLeaks started to look into cryptocurrency when that happened, and I think that's one of the best showcases of showing why we need censorship-resistant monetary systems. And in terms of monetary policy, that's even more interesting, and I think so. I mentioned previously that what the government can do with the central bank when the government is very interconnected with the central bank is that they can basically, by printing money and giving it to the government to do what they want with, they're basically reallocating wealth from the savers in the country to the government. And I mean, the ideal scenario, if the government wants more money from the population to fund things, they would tax the population and get in money that way. But when they have the power to just print more money, then they don't need to tax people. They can just print more money, and it has the same effect. It's just that people don't notice that in the same way. I mean, and also it's a great distraction, because if I think that everybody here has probably heard about the hyperinflation that happened to the Weimar Republic after the First World War in Germany, and we talk about like hyperinflation being some sort of natural disaster that happened to Germany, but we don't talk so much about that. Hyperinflation was caused by the Weimar Republic printing a bunch of banknotes, and that destroyed the value of the currency. So we can confuse, like when governments are printing money, it's very easy for them to come up with these fancy words like quantitative easing or hyperinflation, and it feels like something that is just happening. But the governments and the central banks have a direct control to actually inflict these things upon us, and I don't think that's widely understood by a lot of people. So that's how I would distinguish between monetary infrastructure and monetary policy.
Do you have any predictions? Is it possible for the Venezuela to create its own better system, and when it might happen?
Well, I think that's sort of the issue here, because when the government, when the country is no longer a functional democracy, it's very hard to change those systems from the inside out. And that's why with technology you can just provide these people with an alternative solution, and you don't have to ask for permission to use another monetary system. You can just do it, and that's very empowering.
Yeah, no government want to give up their power and just do something else. How? What would be your call to action when it comes to this? To people living in the countries like this, where they struggle with maybe corrupt central banking?
Well, I think the call to action is already here. I mean, these people have had their lives destroyed, and I don't understand how the Venezuelan government will ever be able to rebuild that trust. So I think that those countries will perhaps be the first to adopt other decentralized monetary systems, because they've shown what can happen. I mean, another way would be to actually get the democratic control over the government and force a separation between the central banks and the state. But if that doesn't happen on its own, if you can't push those changes using the democratic tools, then I don't see any other option by just doing it without the permission from the government.
We're going to talk a little bit more about peer-to-peer monetary system versus file sharing system. That's one of the...
Yeah, oh yeah, like when we talk about like why is this change happening now, like why didn't we come up with this many years ago? I think it's both that we've seen with the financial crisis that there's a need for other forms of monetary systems, and we've also shown with the file sharing systems that it's possible to build resilient, robust protocols that can't be shut down. I mean, I don't think that anybody has missed how much governments and companies have been struggling to shut down file sharing systems. And that's because they're peer-to-peer protocols. There's no central server that can be censored or shut down. And if we leverage the same type of network architecture, but for money, then those systems should be as resilient as the file sharing system. So the peer-to-peer network technology here actually plays one of the fundamental roles to why this is possible now.
Could you give us an example of how it might work?
Oh, yeah, well, so for a monetary system, it's much more complex than a file sharing system, because I I mean, file sharing is pretty easy. You just I download a file from you, and then I share that, and people can download that file from me. It's just copying files, right? But if you want to have a peer-to-peer monetary system, that's obviously a lot more complicated because you need the full history of everything that has happened in the past. You need to have a list of who owns which asset. And you need to build this list synchronized with everybody else in the network. So it's much more complicated, and I think that's why we haven't had them for a long time, because it's actually a very complicated computer science problem to solve. How do we build a decentralized monetary system? But that's where we are getting now. Like, I mean, that's been possible since the advent of blockchain for 10 years now, and yeah, so. That's what I would say, how peer-to-peer protocols relate to cryptocurrency.
And you have prepared a presentation for us, but I was hoping to, maybe we can ask the audience a couple of questions before we go to that. If you have any questions before we go to presentation, yeah, of course.
Sorry, I have several questions, but I don't want to monopolize your time. So you know the three functions of money: a store of value, a unit of account, and a medium of exchange. You don't have to sell us on the idea that traditional banking has problems. My question really is, to what extent does cryptocurrency solve these problems? We know, for example, you mentioned, for example, how the Bolivar had like widely varying, volatile rates, but recently, cryptocurrencies had the same problem, where you would refresh, and by the time you refresh, it has a completely different value. So this kind of makes us a little bit skeptical about storing value there. There's also the matter of speed, where, I mean, it would take between 20 minutes to maybe sometimes days to add something to propagate all across. And this kind of also presents a difficulty for using it as kind of, okay, this doesn't make a difference if you're actually using it as a saving, but not for daily transactions. One more question about, when you started, you said, you mentioned that even things like drugs and gambling, etc., they're also expressions of, individual freedom. But you must be also aware that there are dictatorships that actually they make their money through money laundering, and then they store it on, as cryptocurrency, and then they use that to actually fund anti-democratic movements across the world. So, there's also a dark side to that.
Right. So, what was the first question again?
Changing.
Right. So, yes. So, obviously, there's been massive speculation in cryptocurrencies. But if we look at why cryptocurrency has lost its value, if you look from December of last year until now, if we look at the root cause of that, what we can say is that, and we compare it to the Bolivar situation, the big difference there is that the supply of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies hasn't changed. So that's not the thing that is causing the value to decrease. But with the Bolivar, that's exactly the reason why the value is decreasing there. So there's two different phenomena. One is a speculative bubble, and those go up and those go down. But if you look at the long-term price of Bitcoin, I mean, at the beginning of 2017 until now, it's gone from $1,000 to $7,000. The long-term trend is up, and you cannot possibly say that about the Bolivar. But yes, there are speculative bubbles in cryptocurrencies, and that's because they're not widely adopted yet. People are speculating in the fact that they will be. So I think that those are two completely different categories of problems. And then to your second question about transaction speeds, yes, I will go into that in my presentation. But if we take Bitcoin, for example, Bitcoin is currently limited to around 6 transactions per second. What I would recommend that if you want to get into this topic, is you should look up the Lightning Network. So the Lightning Network is a new second layer technology. That's a good analogy there is that imagine that the whole Bitcoin network now functions on a multicast or broadcast as a broadcast network where everything is propagated to everybody. There are ways using smart contracts in Bitcoin where you can build bilateral payment channels, and you can up those channels instantly, and you can do as many transactions as you want, and you only settle like the final balances of those transactions on the actual chain. So there's tremendous of development happening in these cryptocurrency protocols. I've been working with this for a long time, and I have no doubt in my mind that we will address the scalability problems. And to your third point about the fact that cryptocurrencies can be used to fund also bad activities, like they can fund terrorism. I mean, that's something that I think is always the problem for any type of technology that liberates people. If you think about encryption, for instance, we have the situation where pedophiles can encrypt their child pornography. But should we then prevent cryptography for everybody? And that relates to so many other things, like cell phones. Should we provide cell phones? Are great, but there are also criminals using cell phones. There are criminals using internet. Every type of new technology that provides some sort of freedom is going to be used by malicious people too. And I don't think that the right way is to ban those technologies.
Nobody's saying we should ban it, but I think we should be mindful of the dark side.
Yeah, but I absolutely agree with that. But I don't think that the right path is to, try to hinder the phenomenon of cryptocurrency. So I'm not really sure how to address that. I find it just as hard as trying to address the situation with cryptography. At the end of the day, we have no way to hinder people from. We have no way to hinder criminal people from encrypting their messages, and we won't have any way to hinder criminals to use Bitcoin either. That's just the situation.
Do you want to do your presentation first and then take the questions?
Well, how are we on time?
We have time.
So how long have we been going for?
You've talked for 20 minutes.
Okay, well, we can do a couple of more questions.
Okay, who was first? I think you were, and then Amber. Yeah.
Okay. So as you mentioned, like, do you want to shout loudly?
If you speak very loudly, but I can also repeat your question.
I'll come here, but I'll sit down so no one can see me. How's that? So as you bring up the Lightning Network being a layer 2 solution that is essentially providing the service of netting and compression in a traditional financial system. So I also see people want to try to, say, short Bitcoin, and now initially it was created as a system that's real-time gross settlement but doesn't really contain a concept of credit. So you kind of see people over time discovering and then implementing things that approximate traditional financial products, like settlement and compression. So do you think that the longer-term implications are that we recreate all of the same types of financial products simply on Bitcoin or a decentralized sort of system? And would that be better if there's no controllers of that network? Or should credit not exist? Like, what is the future of finance?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I'm going to try to address your question. I hope I interpret it correctly. And I guess the main point is that the Lightning Network does not actually function on a credit basis. They function on pre-funded channels. Yeah. Yeah, if you have pre-funded channels, then there's less liquidity, but at least you don't get the credit risks. But you can say that in order to use the dollar, you have to pre-fund your dollars with actual money as well. And I guess what you're referring to is that in the current financial system, if I'm JP Morgan and you're Goldman Sachs, we can do thousands of transactions. Okay. We can do thousands of transactions with each other, and the clearinghouses only force us to maintain a small collateral that they think is the risk that one of us defaults. And this system is very efficient because we only actually need to settle the final netted balances. And I guess that and that is the whole thing that is introducing these credit risks. And if many of these participants fail at the same time, the clearinghouses can fail, and that will be a disaster for the economy. I don't think that should be like the goal for cryptocurrencies to strive towards in the first iteration, but I don't think that at the same time we will be able to completely prevent that. But what I do think is important is that if you don't want to participate in that system, then you don't have to. That's the difference with cryptocurrencies, that I can always, I don't have to have my money in Lightning channel. I don't have to have my money in a system that is exposed to those systemic risks. So if I want to, I can withdraw my Bitcoins from exchanges, and I can just have it on my own physical device. And it doesn't matter to me if other people are engaged in these complex financial instruments where there's short squeezes and derivatives that default. You don't need to be exposed to that same type of risk with cryptocurrency. That's my understanding anyway.
Okay. I mean, you're still subject to the currency fluctuations that would happen if there was a short squeeze that was market-wide.
Right. So I mean more in the terms of, so if you have money at a bank, and that bank needs to have some collateral, but I mean they're functioning on a fractional reserve banking, and if they do something, then there's a bunch of customers that they have, and their claims on the bank can default on their claims, and there's no way if you're participating in the current digital economy to actually get your money out of the commercial banks. But with cryptocurrency, you can have money that you control that is not involved in the commercial banking infrastructure.
So I guess then the ultimate question becomes, if the consumer and retail banking system is completely separate than, say, the settlement and clearing infrastructure of the commercial banks separately, because you are, I guess, working on like blockchain settlement systems for institutional kind of systems, not retail stuff, right? Like, does one or the other of those win to the detriment, or do they have to learn to work together to get regular retail people who don't want to participate to have a financial system that is separate from people who are doing very complex and liquidity intensive investment and corporate banking and treasury services type operations?
Okay, that's a hard question. But I think what you're alluding to is that finance in the institutional world works differently than from like how retail cryptocurrency exchanges function now, where because of the liquidity issue, financial institutions want to always have risk in order to limit the amount of collateral that they need to have locked up in the systems. And I think cryptocurrencies are great in that in this regard, just because of that that you don't need to participate. You don't need to be a member of an exchange if you don't want to. You don't need to be exposed to those default risks if you don't want to. You can take your money out of those exchanges. So I think that you don't have to be exposed to that risk. Am I addressing your question correctly? Somewhat. Okay, yeah, let's have a beer later and let's get deeper into that. One thing that we perhaps didn't mention so much in the initial introduction was like one of the reasons that we wanted to have this presentation was that in terms of cryptocurrency and how that relates to freedom, there are now obviously a lot of other cryptocurrency protocols. And when you observe cryptocurrencies from the lens of the Freedom Forum and what is important to economic liberty and personal freedom, the question then becomes, are all these cryptocurrencies the same? So I'm going to explain from a high-level perspective how a blockchain works and what sort of the fall pits are. Like how can a cryptocurrency fail to meet up to what originally made cryptocurrencies interesting. And parts of this presentation will probably be very technical, and there's a good reason for that. So I'm, like Maria said, a cryptocurrency systems analyst, and I'm very engaged in the public discourse on these topics. So I can't oversimplify things because that would lead to saying incorrect things, and I would get a lot of shit for that afterwards. So I'll try to keep some sort of middle line between those things. So one fascinating thing, if you want to build a monetary system that keeps track of who owns what. So if we have a system like Bitcoin, what you essentially need in order for that system to work is you need a list of who owns how many Bitcoins. And an interesting thing is that we can actually build such a list just by compiling everyone's transactions. So if we have a system where Carol is sending 15 Bitcoins to Alice, and Alice is sending 5 Bitcoins to Bob, if we just gather up all those transactions, then we can we can take that and we can get a list of who owns what just by putting the transactions in the correct order. We obviously need to do some other things also. We can't let invalid transactions get processed. And by that I mean, let's say, for example, that I got $150 from my aunt on my birthday. And then I go out and I spend $100 in a transaction to buy a pizza, and then $100 on a taxi. Now the system needs to know which one of these transactions happened first. If it's the pizza driver, then what should happen is that the pizza driver gets the money, and then when I go and try to buy the pizza, the transaction gets rejected. So we need to filter out all transactions that try to spend money that we don't have. And obviously we need to filter out like all completely malformed transactions. But what we primarily need in order for this to function is that we need some sort of ordering service. And what the ordering service does is that, okay, so we have a system and there are hundreds of thousands of people and they're all broadcasting their transaction. There's Carol and there's Bob and there's Alice, and all of these people wants to share their transaction with the network. So the ordering service needs to take all those transactions and decide on which order did these transactions happen in. If we can get that, if we can get a synchronized list of all the transactions that happened, then we can actually have a list that everyone in the system can agree to. That is the current valid list. So this is an order. So you probably heard about ordering services like these before. If you heard about mining in Bitcoin, what the miners are is essentially an ordering service for Bitcoin. So they listen to the transactions in the system, and they agree on what the orders of those transactions are. And why? So what does mining and ordering have to do with each other? So if we want the system to be democratic, we can't let a single individual be in control of what the order of the transactions are, because then we give an enormous amount of control to that party. That party could, for instance, refuse to see certain transactions. He could say that I've never seen that transaction, and that transaction gets censored from the system. So we need to have a democratic ordering service. So one of the way that Bitcoin has solved this problem is by you take turns by ordering transactions. So every actor in the system, every miner in the systems in the system gets the opportunity to order transactions in a specific time slot. And then the idea is that these miners take turns creating these blocks of transactions. And the reason that you're doing this with mining in Bitcoin, there are many reasons to that, but one of the reasons is that we don't want the ordering service, the members of the ordering service, to be well-known individuals. We want them to have the opportunity to be anonymous. So how do you distinguish identities in an anonymous system? You can do that with computing power. There are cryptographic strings that you can produce that proves that you control a certain amount of electricity. So if I devote 1% of the electricity that is currently being contributed to the Bitcoin system, then I will get to then I will get to create the blocks 1% of the times. So, like one of the problems that Bitcoin is facing, like you were speaking about earlier, is that we can only process around 6 updates per second in the current model. And the reason that we can only do that has not so much to do with the miners. It's not the miners that are slow. What is the fundamental limitation is that, okay, yes, so we have all of these transactions. They're all being sorted into a synchronized list. But in order for everybody to have the ability to validate that list has been constructed correctly, everyone in the system needs to download all of the transactions in the system, and they need to validate that the transactions are valid on their own computers. So the reason why Bitcoin is slow is not that the technology is outdated. It's slow intentionally. The limit is there to allow my computer that I have at home to download all the transactions in the system, so that I, independently of anybody else, can build my own view of the blockchain. So if we look at the market, how it looks right now, this was in 2016 and this is in 2018. What we've seen is that Bitcoin is no longer the super dominant #1 anymore. There's the alternative currencies that are competing with Bitcoin have gained a lot of ground. And one of the primary reasons why that is happening is that people are disappointed, or they don't feel that it's very encouraging that Bitcoin can only do 6 transactions per second. So these alternative currencies are growing rapidly now. And this is a chart. This orange part here shows how much of the market share that Bitcoin controls among cryptocurrencies. So this was in 2016. Bitcoin was around 80%, and then it's fallen drastically in the last couple of years. And one of the fundamental reasons to that is that people are skeptical about the scalability of the Bitcoin protocol. Now, this is a quote by David Chaum, and he described from his perspective. So David Chaum is one of the forefathers of anonymous communication. And when the internet was new, he wanted to provide people with the tools to retain their privacy while doing financial transactions on the internet. And what he realized that when the web was expanding rapidly, there were less and less people that actually cared about privacy. People cared more about convenience and being able to do things quickly than they cared about maintaining the privacy. And we can see today, like 20 years later, what that has led to. We now have, the web was originally intended to be a peer-to-peer protocol, that I would have my files on my website, and everybody would have their own website, and we would be in control of our own data. But in order to make things more convenient, we've all consolidated on these centralized platforms like Google and Facebook owns all of our data now. And that's just because convenience is more attractive to the average consumer. So I think it's very important that if it's possible, that we don't let that happen again. Because we have an opportunity now with cryptocurrency to create a system that preserves our personal liberties. But if we forget what is important, then all of that can be for nothing. So this picture, I know that it looks very complicated, and I probably made this unnecessarily complex, but it's just describing the only thing that this image is showing is you have a bunch of transactions. You need to get those transactions in a specific order, and then everybody will get the same view of who owns what in the system. So how do these new cryptocurrencies, how do they differ from Bitcoin? And I would say that they primarily differ on three fundamental things. So that's, they have different monetary policies. The ordering service is fundamentally different. The ordering service is one of the primary aspects of cryptocurrency that most innovation is happening on, where experimental ordering services are being tried out. So instead of just miners now, we also have proof of stakes, we have stakers, we have validators, we have producers, and we even have bakers now. So there's a lot of innovation and different things being tried out. And that's very good, that's very exciting, and it's really interesting to see what is happening there. But perhaps what is less understood is how do those things affect the fundamental things that made cryptocurrencies interesting and attractive and a way for people to escape control and to retain their economic freedom. And the last thing that is fundamentally different across cryptocurrencies is the throughput. And that's the numbers of transactions per second that is allowed to pass through these systems. So we'll go through these three, starting from the bottom, and see how changes in those impacts the economic liberty and the decentralizations of the systems. So we'll start with throughput. So in Bitcoin, we have these 6 updates per second. And that's great because that allows everybody to validate every transaction in the system. So what happens now if we say that we want to be able to do 10,000 transactions per second? What if a cryptocurrency says that, yeah, we're like Bitcoin, but we're doing 10,000s of transactions per second? Well, the only thing that happens is that now nobody will have time. Nobody will have, a normal person, I won't be able on my computer to process all those transactions in my computer. So what happens instead? Well, what happens then is that I have no way of actually knowing what is the status, what is the ledger in the system, because I can't keep up with all the updates that is happening. So what I will have to do instead is I will have to ask the ordering service, how much Bitcoin do I have in my account? And the ordering service then, what happens then is that we've fundamentally flipped we turned the table around. So instead of the ordering service being strictly controlled, they can only produce transactions that are valid. They can only put valid transactions into the system. What we have now is that the whole system becomes much more black boxed, and we're just relying on this ordering service to tell us what the status of the system is. So by doing that, we've fundamentally lost what was one of the prime reasons why cryptocurrencies were empowering. So I'm gonna this is a list of the top 17 cryptocurrencies right now. And I'm going to filter out the cryptocurrencies that have decided to abandon the notion of being able to validate all the transactions on your computer in order to get higher throughput in the system. So that's a lot. That's actually quite a lot of the top cryptocurrencies that have abandoned the notion of what is one of the most important things for a cryptocurrency in order to make transactions flow faster through the system. If we then look at the ordering service, so one of the most fascinating thing with the Bitcoin system is that in order to produce an update to the system, to construct a block that contains transactions that updates the state of the who owns what in the system, that is something that costs money. But the reason this works out is because you actually, if you are participating in the ordering service, you actually get rewarded. So by producing this update, yeah, you lose You have to spend, let's say, $100,000 in resources in order to be able to produce this using the electricity that I mentioned previously. But you get the reward from the system that is higher. So the ordering service doesn't lose any money to update the system. It's actually earning money, and that is why people are participating in the ordering service. And why is this so important? Well, let's say that this ordering service, when you connect to the system, you are completely new to the system. And the ordering service, the intention of the ordering service is malicious. And it's going to show you a state of the system that is different from what everybody else is seeing. So it's going to say that, okay, well, let's say if you're Carol here, it's going to say that you have 12 Bitcoin, when the reality is that you have 10 Bitcoin. And why is that a bad thing? Well, the ordering service can trick you that you have received money, and that can lead to you thinking that you have been paid, and you can release some other asset for that. So if he's buying something, he can pretend that he's buying something from you, but he's not actually giving you any money. Now, the reason, if you are here and you know that this ordering service, it costs $100,000 just to produce this update. And if there's in fact actually a real one that everybody else is using, then if he's created a fake version just for you, then he must be at a very big loss now, because he's essentially spent $200,000 and he's only getting $100,000 back, because you're only getting money from the real one. So you know that if you are new to the system and somebody's showing you a bunch of ledger updates, then you know if those have a cost to them, that it's very unlikely that he's spending all this money just to fool you. And this is, I would say, one of the fundamental things that allowed Bitcoin to be trustless. That's how we could, as a new person syncing, when I'm starting my Bitcoin software and I'm downloading the history of the transactions, that we have this game theory property here is one of the fundamental things that was one of the revolutionary things of Bitcoin that allows the system to function without trust. We have economic incentives and game theory instead of trust. So an ordering service that functions like this, we can say that it's secured through economic disincentivization. Now let's look again on how many cryptocurrencies that has abandoned one of the things that was revolutionary about cryptocurrency in order to get other advantages. Also, quite a lot of them do. Now, another thing that the ordering service can do is, I mentioned previously, the ordering service can pretend that it doesn't see your transaction. So if you are WikiLeaks and you have received a bunch of Bitcoin, now if the government tells you you should not allow WikiLeaks to spend their money, then every time that the ordering service sees that WikiLeaks wants to do a transaction, it simply pretends that I didn't see that transaction. And the reason why that's a big problem for blockchain networks is that it's impossible for somebody else to prove that the ordering service is actually seeing that transaction. We can't prove that the message has been received because of the fundamental architecture of how the internet works. We can never prove that the message hasn't been lost in the internet. So how do we do that? How can we make sure that the ordering service can't pretend to not see transactions? Well, the obvious thing is that, okay, first of all, we shouldn't just have one guy here. It should be many guys, and so that not one individual participant can decide to pretend to not see a transaction. But what is also very important is that even if there are many members in the ordering service, we need to make sure that those people are not easy to recognize, that they don't have identity so that they can be coerced and that they can't collude among themselves. So we actually need an ordering service where there are a bunch of people that are ordering transactions, but they don't really know who each other are. And an entity that would want to coerce these people to censor transactions don't know who these guys are either. So we need some sort of anonymous participation in the ordering service system. And that's what the mining in Bitcoin allows, because you can express your identity through electricity. Other protocols use very clear identity-driven ordering service. If you look at EOS, for instance, they have 21 members in the ordering service, and they get together in a conference call with another. They know each other by first name, and if one evil actor gets a hold of these identities, he knows who they are. It's not extremely unlikely for him to be able to coerce these people that they should censor a specific transaction. So let's look at now how many cryptocurrencies have abandoned the notion of anonymous ordering service participation. Also, quite a lot of them have. So I'll go to the last point here, monetary policy. And I know for people who are, for most people, when I say monetary policy, that probably sounds like it has something to do with interest rates. But I'm more talking about how coins are created, what is the distribution, and what is the money supply inflation. So one of the things that has made Bitcoin very attractive is that it has the properties of a hard currency, which means that there's a fixed cap to the amount of coins that can ever exist in the system. You don't have constant inflation. The money supply has a fixed limit. And what also exists in Bitcoin is that it's expensive to create new coins. In order to create new coins, it has to do with that mining service that I mentioned previously. When you are participating in the mining service, creating these blocks, then you are also rewarded in Bitcoins, and that's how Bitcoin has been introduced into the world. So if we're talking about like cryptocurrency, that's as something that is supposed to be democratic, something that is supposed to change the monetary system, if you had that perspective in mind, would you accept a cryptocurrency that started out with a single entity owning all the coins? So if I'm saying like I'm creating a cryptocurrency and I own all of those coins, and you have to buy them from me, would that seem like a fair? Would that seem like a fair democratic monetary system that you would want to participate in? So let's look at the cryptocurrencies that where a significant portion, sometimes all of the coins in those cryptocurrencies were assigned to a specific entity that got the responsibility to sell those or distribute those however it wanted. Ripple, by the way, actually still owns 60% of all the Ripple coins. And also we'll remove the ones that have abandoned the notion of being devoid from inflation. So if we look at the coins that actually have inflation and the coins that started out with an unfair distribution and apply that filter, it's also quite a lot that don't subscribe to this notion of hard currency. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to apply all of these filters. And what's interesting here is that, yes, these cryptocurrencies are competing with Bitcoin, but they're not only failing on just one of the properties that makes Bitcoin a democratic, fair currency. They're actually failing. Some of them are actually failing on every single aspect of that. And like, I don't want to say that the only cryptocurrency that is interesting is Bitcoin because of this reason. I think that there's there's room for experimentation in between Bitcoin and traditional fiat systems, centralized systems. But if what we're trying to achieve is to provide people with the tools to liberate themselves from singular or a consortium of entities, then we should be aware that most of these cryptocurrencies are not meeting up to those standards. So if we remove all of those cryptocurrencies, the only ones that actually maintain these properties are Bitcoin and Litecoin. And Litecoin is actually, it's basically just a clone of Bitcoin. The characteristics of Litecoin are nearly identical to Bitcoin. So it doesn't provide any innovation or interesting trade-offs or anything like that. So it's not particularly interesting. So I guess, like, if you, one of the primary difficulties for the cryptocurrency industry right now is that we've had a massive influx of new users in the community. They don't know which questions to ask in order to understand whether or not a cryptocurrency is actually about personal freedom and economic liberty. And another reason for that is that many of these new projects are heavily funded. They have enormous marketing teams, and they always mention, so basically this is a game of trade-offs. You can trade decentralization for higher throughput. But the issue is that none of these cryptocurrencies are very open about talking about the negative side of the trade-offs that they've done. They're only showing you the how much transactions per second you want to do, how much transactions per second they can do. And for me, that reminds me of like if you have a mobile phone and you want to get a new one, and you go to a phone store and you want to have a good camera, and the phone salesman tells you that, well, this camera has 14 megapixels. And you think, oh, that phone must be much better than my current one. If you have, like, let's say, for example, you have an iPhone with only 6 megapixels, and you get this new one with 14 megapixels. But then when you actually take the pictures with that phone, you realize that the picture is actually not improved. It's worse. And the reason for that is it's not the megapixels that creates a beautiful image. It's the amount of light that can go through the lens and how the color balancing works. So what I really want to say is that let's not get confused about what is actually important when it comes to cryptocurrency. That's everything. Thank you. Yeah, and we'll do some questions, and feel free to reach out on me on Twitter if you want to engage in a conversation. And what I will say is that if you follow me on Twitter, and I find, like, I'm not a person that exclusively thinks that Bitcoin is the only currency that we should have or care about. I think that if there is a cryptocurrency that arrives to the scene that actually is able to innovate on top of Bitcoin, but without sacrificing censorship resistance and decentralization, then we should cherish that. And if I ever find a cryptocurrency that does that, I'll be the first to tell you to let you know. So yeah, well, we can do questions. Do we have a microphone that we can, or we can just? It's a small room. I think that you can just speak loudly, and I'll try to answer.
I think it's for the streaming. It's good for the streaming.
Okay. Okay, but the cable is not.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, we're good. Yeah. You want me to hand this one out?
Yep.
Okay, great. Who's got questions? And then we'll go back to you next. Yeah. Okay.
You had an interesting question there. You had an interesting comment there when you said they're experiments. So out of everything that you filtered out, what are some lessons that can be learned to improve the Bitcoin project?
To improve the Bitcoin project.
Are there any lessons? Something interesting that some other Bitcoin did, another cryptocurrency did that would be useful for the Bitcoin project?
I think that this will get very technical, but I think one thing that will be very interesting to see is what happens when the block reward disappears. Right now, Bitcoin is secure because these miners are fighting to receive the Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency. But what happens when there's only transaction fees? Will the system actually be stable? So if they're not, then Bitcoin might have to change. We might have to actually have a small amount of inflation in Bitcoin all the time in order to keep, in order for there to be a reason for the miners to use their energy to secure the ledger. So that's definitely interesting. But what I think, like lessons in general, I think that what people need to know is that what I would want people to have is a list of questions that they ask a new cryptocurrency in order to understand whether or not that cryptocurrency is decentralized and censorship resistant or not, or if it even cares about personal liberty. So one of those questions can be, is it possible to do client-side validation? Am I, as a person in this network, able to see all the transactions, and can I validate them on my computer? Can I participate anonymously in the ordering service? What is the monetary? How does the monetary policy behave? Is there inflation in this system? How was the currency created initially? Is there a single entity that controls a majority of the currency? And also this ledger counterfeit problem. Like, is there any cost when I'm syncing to the blockchain? Is what I'm seeing? Can I be sure that there's been a cost to produce what I'm seeing? If people had those 4 questions, I think that they would be able to scrutinize projects, and it doesn't mean that everything that doesn't fulfill those criteria are useless, but at least it allows you to understand that there has been some fundamental trade-offs underlying that has allowed these cryptocurrencies to perhaps get an advantage in another area.
It's probably useful to kind of describe. It's probably useful to describe what is the nightmare scenario in each of these questions, if the answer is no.
Right. The nightmare scenario is, in most of those cases, it has to do with that you thought that you received Bitcoin, but it turns out you didn't because the ordering service manipulated you, or that the governance mechanism is such that you don't have any ability to detect when rules of the systems are being changed, and you need to rely on other individuals to tell you that has happened. Yeah.
Perfect, Eric. We're going to do one more question, so it's going to be good. And then Eric's going to stay, right, together with all of us, so we can stay around here and have a drink and ask more questions.
I just wanted to ask.
Staying here.
Not going anywhere.
Hello. I just wanted to ask, how come you did not include the very important cryptocurrency Dogecoin, which innovated in the field of...
Actually, Dogecoin would have done very well on this chart. It's one of the better ones. It's better than most ones when it comes to personal freedom and economic liberty.
Slightly more serious, and I realize an incendiary question, but what do you think about... What was it that eliminated Bitcoin Cash, and what do you think about the claim that Blockstream is exercising centralized control over Bitcoin Core's development?
Right. So there was actually only one thing that eliminated Bitcoin Cash, and that's that they prioritize throughput before client-side validation. So that means that the general idea within the Bitcoin Cash community is that because miners have done so heavy investments into the infrastructure, they're very unlikely to try to attack the system because they have an economic incentive. Well, I don't really agree with that notion because, yes, it can cost a lot for the miners if they destroy the system. But what happens if a state infiltrates the system? what happens if a government takes control of all the mining equipment, then that protection is gone. Now, I would say that Bitcoin Cash is still one of the most robust cryptocurrencies, and that's because like if you're in an EOS system or a Stellar system, when you get the ledger updates, the only thing that you're validating is that the right amount of signatures are there, and there's no cost to that. But in Bitcoin Cash, even if you're not reading all the transactions, you can still validate that the amount of energy has been spent to produce that ledger that you're seeing. So Bitcoin Cash retains many of the economic incentives, but it's weaker against certain forms of attacks. And I think it's very interesting what Bitcoin Cash is doing is that they think what is important right now is to get as many people as possible using the currency, and we can care about hardcore decentralization and control later. And many of them actually believe that the controls that you can do in Bitcoin Cash are sufficient, and that's something that I have 1,000 opinions on. And please reach out to me on Twitter, and I'm very glad to get into the very, very technical and nitty-gritty details of that. It's one of my favorite areas to discuss.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to thank you all for being here. This is sort of scratching the surface of this really interesting, very deep community in the crypto and blockchain space. I'm really grateful for Eric for coming and sharing all of his knowledge in a way that he had to dumb down as much as possible for us. But I think that's really important, and I hope you ask provocative questions about new technologies that you interact with, because at this point it's very important. What kind of technology we build is going to dictate the society that we live in. And if we care about personal freedoms and human rights, and if we care about not having one entity or authority having all the decision-making power, then we probably want to build a particular kind of technology, or at least technologies that lean towards helping individuals as opposed to helping one authority. And if you want to continue to have these conversations with us, we're going to have events around the year with the Oslo Freedom Forum brand here in Norway and around the world. And I hope you all come to our event in May on the 27 to 29, where we'll have the main Oslo Freedom Forum Summit. I want to thank John and Maria again for having us here at Blockchangers, hopefully the first of many events we do together. So thanks again.
Perfect.